Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Narendra Dami, Executive Lead of New Power Labs, Labo Pouvoir Innovant. I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And the space is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Paving the way within equity, diversity, and inclusion practices requires active commitment and engagement. We would like to thank all of those who played a role in this work and everyone who's with us today from across the country. Today, we're going to be talking about the In the Dark report, which looks at assessing progress toward equity, diversity, and inclusion across impact investors and social impact accelerators. And this work was done in partnership with New Power Labs, Social Innovation Academy, and SETSI. And so we'll jump into that. So today's session is the English session. Tomorrow we will have a French session, and the details can be found on our LinkedIn, and we can also we'll put them into the chat if you know any French colleagues who would like to join us tomorrow for this discussion. And we want to take just a moment to acknowledge all of the individuals that were part of creating this report. The authors, Sherilyn, Emily, myself, the advisors, Victor and Jaleesa. This research was funded by New Power Labs and SETSI, and in-kind support was provided by Social Innovation Academy and New Power Labs. And this work would not have been possible without the deep engagement of the sector. We worked in partnership with social impact accelerators, with impact investors from across the country, which enabled us to consolidate these insights. So we have a packed agenda for today, and we want to make sure we leave enough time for discussion and questions. So we're going to kick it off with a series of introductions. And then we're going to talk about and jump into the In the Dark report, where we're going to look at the progress toward equity, diversity, and inclusion within the social finance and social innovation sector. For some of you, the terminology we're using, the acronyms, will be very familiar. For others, one of our colleagues will be putting definitions within the chat. So you can then understand or clarify any things that might not be as clear. So we're going to jump into, when we're talking about the report, the research design, the key insights, the discussion, which is bringing in not only what we learned through the survey and through the interviews, but also complementing that with secondary research, and then a path forward that is both including immediate actions that the sector, the social finance, the social innovation sector can take, but also includes kind of broad concepts that we can embed into our work as we move forward. And we'll be closing it off with a Q&A. So to get started, I want to do a quick round of introductions for the folks who've been deeply engaged in this work. I myself, Narendra Dami, again, executive lead at New Power Labs. I do wear a few different hats, including running a private family foundation and a small impact investment fund. I'm a practitioner, both deploying capital and operating, and have had been in the social finance and the social innovation sector since 2008, working both in the Global South, predominantly across West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, but also across Canada and the United States. A combination of microfinance, venture philanthropy, and impact investing, both at an operational level and at a deployer of capital lens. And so it's been a really great journey. And the one thing that stands out to me is that when I started this journey, the conversations of equity, diversity, and inclusion, the conversation of racism, the conversation of how we can live our values through equity was not a conversation we were having. And so very excited to dig into the work today. New Power Labs is one of the partners on this work. We are a think tank, do tank focused on equitable flows of capital. We are essentially a collective platform informing and empowering a more inclusive financial future. We aggregate, synthesize knowledge and resources. We lead our own research to uncover actionable tools and best practices on how we can transform the way in which equity, diversity, and inclusion is applied by practitioners. And we work across the capital spectrum. So from philanthropy to impact investing, to venture capital, to traditional bank financing. New Power Labs is a partnership in itself. We have a growing group of co-founders that include Duca Impact Lab, Community Foundations of Canada, Ontario Trillium Foundation, Coast Capital Savings, and World Education Services. So on that note, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Emily, to do a brief introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Émilie Nollet, and I'm the research lead at New Power Labs. So I joined this research in August. The data had already been collected, so it was very exciting to be able to dig into this research and to do some analysis and work with the team, with SIA, with SETSI. But really to become part of the team at New Power Labs. So I'm also a postdoctoral fellow at St. Paul's University based in Ottawa. I specialize in inclusive leadership, and I did my doctoral research on in management, entrepreneurship, and strategy. I founded a company called Urban Food Ecosystems, translated like that, to produce aquaponics systems, so aquaculture and hydroponics put together in symbiosis. And the goal was to make those food production systems inclusive for communities. So inclusion was always at the root of everything that I've been wanting to do. And now I may pass the word to Victor Beausoleil.
Thank you so much, Emily. Greetings, folks. My name is Victor Beausoleil. I'm currently the Executive Director of SETSI, which stands for Social Economy Through Social Inclusion. I'm a husband, father of 4, and I give thanks to my ancestors for the opportunity to contribute and to build today. SETSI works on all things that we conceptualize and perceive as social innovation, so social finance, social economy, social acquisitions, the cooperative movement, and impact investing. And a lot of our work is around inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, and working on creating a subsequent space of belonging. This work led us from the Solidarity Working Group, which is an ecosystem of roughly around 109 members right now that we co-founded 2 years ago. And the Solidarity Working Group has 2 remarkable co-chairs and 3 committees: the Research Committee, the Activations Committee, as well as the Funding and Partnerships Committee. And a lot of the work of the Research Committee led us to trying to find ways and means to really crack the code around DEI within the impact investing space and social finance ecosystem. And I'm really inspired by the work and the partnership that we've developed and formed with Social Innovation Academy and New Power Labs. And I'm excited to once again share the findings of this report with all of you. My colleague Jaleesa won't be here this evening. We're double booked. She'll be here tomorrow for the French session, and I'll be here this evening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Victor. My name is Sherilyn Chalk. I'm the Executive Director and a co-founder of the Social Innovation Academy. I'm grateful to be joining today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, known today as Vancouver. So at the Social Innovation Academy, what we do is we run training programs for young people all across Canada who hope to work in the social impact, social innovation, and social finance ecosystem one day. And we've been around for about 3 years, and over that time have trained analysts and fellows, about 200 in total, to work in the sector. And every summer we have this amazing cohort of analysts who have capacity, and we work on a national scale project. And this was the work that was done in summer 2021. And I think what's important to mention, kind of linking back to Narinder's opening, is that I started my journey in my career pretty recently, and I'm very grateful to be working in this sector and in this time where we can have these open conversations and really start to dig into how we can address equity further in our work. So with that, I'll pass it over to Narinder just to share a little bit more about the background of our research.
Yeah, and as you'll see, this is a quick snapshot of our journey. There's been many layers of why we've come together with New Power Labs, SETSI, and SIA. So 2020, we are in many ways still in the COVID pandemic, but 2020 at the onset sparked a different type of conversation, a different type of openness to address equity among organizations worldwide. And Sherilyn mentioned even that shift that she's experienced as somebody earlier in her journey. But this is such a positive change for us. So what we see in the sector and we see broadly is an increase in the number and in the frequency of conversations around equity, around racial justice, and how it connects into the sector of social finance and social innovation. And for many ways, the sector of social finance and social innovation and equity are connected so deeply in what we're trying to achieve. However, as we embarked more deeply on these conversations, what became more clear was that there was a lack of clarity around standards and guidelines for improving equity within organizations and within the broader sector. And what we saw was that good intentions were widespread. However, the sector remained in the dark around quantifying and qualifying tangible progress toward real change when it comes to equity. And that led us to this report. And I'm going to move it over to Sherilyn, who will walk through the first part of the report in the dark.
Great. So the reason we're all here today is to really dive into our findings and kind of, what we're taking away and into the path forward from here. So as we jump into the report, just want to touch on our parameters that we were working with here. So the intention of this work was to really advance EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion within the social innovation and social finance sector by translating for the first time anecdotal knowledge, things we've heard in conversations, one-on-one, in group settings, into empirical data. And we spoke to 40 impact investors and social impact accelerators to glean the insights that we're going to share with you today. And these represent approximately 10% of the impact investing organizations that operate in Canada. The focus of our research is on highlighting the promising practices and challenges that are faced by organizations. We are not yet at the point where we can apply a one-size-fits-all solution at this point. And finally, there are some limitations within the work that we're sharing with you today. As these participants represent about 10% of the sector, there's a lot that we don't know and a lot of data that is still left to be collected. So jumping into the research design of this, we wanted to understand specifically how our Canadian impact investors, and that pertains to both impact investing funds and the impact investing arms of foundations and social impact accelerators, addressing EDI within 3 particular layers of their organization. So looking at leadership team, the efforts and responsibilities of an organization's top management, into internal operations, any policies and practices that affect an organization's staff, and finally, how they address EDI within their portfolio and program ventures. So anything for impact investors that touches the ventures that they invest into, and for accelerators, the ventures that are within any incubation or accelerator programs that they run. The methodology behind this work, we reached out to 64 impact investors and social impact accelerators last May, so approximately a year ago now, to participate in our research. And the organizations that we reached out to were were generated through membership of 3 groups. So the Solidarity Working Group that Victor mentioned, the Table of Impact Investment Practitioners, and the Investment Readiness Program partners across Canada. We then received responses from 40 organizations who did both the survey and the interview. The survey was multiple choice questions on a yes/no basis, or on a 5-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And interviews followed up the survey responses so that we could dive deeper into the insights and understanding the nuances of what's happening at these organizations. And the questions that were asked throughout this process really prompted organizations to self-assess their own efforts. We weren't able to really give them a benchmark to assess against. And so that's a really important insight before we dive deeper into our findings. And we're incredibly grateful, I can't stress this enough, to the 40 impact investors and accelerators that did participate in this research. It's the only reason that we're here today to share with you these findings. So we had 27 investors and 13 accelerators that spoke to us last summer. We can see in the map here that I think 48% of them are in the Ontario region, and the others scattered across BC, the Prairies, Quebec, the Yukon, and New Brunswick. And when we think about the limitations, knowing that it's 40 organizations, we do have a small sample size. So the 40 respondents, again, only 10% of the sector. In terms of our recruitment approach, because we were reaching out to organizations that we might have known ourselves or are part of these groups, they might be exposed to conversations and resources related to equity and inclusion already, and thus the findings might not be representative of the average organization within the sector. And finally, looking at self-selection bias, so the organizations had the option to participate or not to. Those who chose to complete the survey and interview may be a bit more familiar and comfortable with talking about these principles. And interestingly, when the organizations that chose not to participate shared their reasons for not participating, it was either because they have still a lot of learning to do and they didn't feel at this point that they were ready to share with us. And also there was a few organizations that mentioned that they are focused right now on climate or environmental initiatives, which really underscores the need to layer in conversations and a lens of equity into all that we do, especially around the climate crisis. So in summary, the results gleaned may not fully represent the efforts found across the average organization within the sector. So beyond categorizing participants into both impact investors and accelerators, we further categorized them into small and large sizes so that we could compare and contrast initiatives across organizations who have a similar size and scale, so different access to resources. So for impact investors, we looked at two factors, the first being team size and the second being assets under management, and we weighted those equally. So in calculating those numbers, we were able to create a group of small impact investors, of which there are 12, and 15 large impact investors. In terms of the social impact accelerators, it was weighed on team size and the number of ventures in their programs, and those weightings were different. They weren't evenly weighted because the number of ventures in a program, if there are more ventures currently participating and a small team size, that might actually negatively affect the organization's capacity to commit to these initiatives. And so there were 6 small social impact accelerators that participated and 7 large. All right, so jumping into the exciting part here, our key findings. They were categorized into 6 buckets: self-perception of EDI efforts, the tracking of self-identified data, EDI efforts within leadership teams, integrating EDI into internal operations, and for impact investors, how they're supporting portfolio ventures with that EDI lens, and for social impact accelerators, how they're supporting program ventures with an EDI lens. So the data, before we share, it's been visualized in a heat map. So you'll see colors from red to green, and these are representing organizations that either agree or strongly agree with a statement or self-report that they have a particular practice in place from 0 to 100%. So our very first insight looks at the self-perception of EDI efforts across organizations. Overall, impact investors and social impact accelerators feel confident that they've taken steps to address EDI. This was a self-assessment that shows the overall intention of organizations to commit to this work. And we can see here that across the leadership team, internal operations, and portfolio and program ventures, the confidence levels are higher within work pertaining to leadership team and internal operations, and a little bit less confident when it comes to engaging with portfolio and program ventures on equity, diversity, and inclusion. In the interview process, we followed up with participants to describe the thinking behind their responses. And for those who agreed and strongly agreed that they have taken steps to address EDI, these were the most commonly mentioned trends. So across the leadership team level for impact investors, they mentioned the role of leadership team members within EDI work, strongly mentioned board nomination process being equitable. For social impact accelerators, 4 times the number of accelerators and investors mentioned the hiring of an EDI consultant. Within our internal operations, we saw that impact investors more often have an internal EDI committee. Meanwhile, accelerators focus on creating an inclusive and empathetic physical and virtual environment for the organizations and the people that come in and out of their spaces. And finally, for portfolio and program ventures, integrating EDI into the selection and due diligence process for impact investors is their key action. And for accelerators, they mentioned partnerships with organizations that serve equity deserving groups. Looking at our next insight around the tracking of self-identified data. So this is the practice of collecting disaggregated data from different lenses. We asked specifically around gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability status. We see that the practice of collecting this data is challenging for organizations, in part due to a lack of standard categories and terminology to use when administering these surveys. So 26% of the organizations surveyed are collecting at least one data point to understand how various folks within their organization self-identify. And for organizations that report anonymized demographic data, gender is the most commonly tracked diversity metric, followed by ethnicity. Overall, few organizations are collecting this data. However, a higher percentage of social impact accelerators than impact investors are doing so. So this graph shows the percentage of investors that are tracking this data across various levels of their organization. And these were only the investors that actually have this team function in place. When I flip to the next screen, you'll be able to see the colors change for social impact accelerators. And we see that there is a higher percentage of accelerators doing so, particularly when it comes to their own team and their program ventures. Okay, so jumping into the EDI efforts across leadership, we see that positively 75% of all organizations have integrated education and action plans focused on reconciliation and decolonizing their practices. In terms of how these commitments are playing out across different organizational types, impact investors have been investing into Indigenous housing and health. Some exclusively grant to and fund youth-led organizations. And for accelerators, their focus is on prioritizing entrepreneurship training that's tailored towards Indigenous founders and conducting research to understand the needs of entrepreneurs. So our next insight is that 38% of organizations have set EDI targets and goals for their leadership team. However, 28% of organizations take this a step further and actually evaluate targets against performance reviews. And for the 15 organizations that have set targets, we see that disaggregated data in some cases is tracked against local municipal data so that they're representing the communities where they're operating. Some mentioned participation in various commitments, which we'll touch on shortly. And the biggest challenge that they identified is finding talent that represents equity deserving communities. And for the 25 organizations that have not yet set targets, close to half have informal goals in place, and less than a third have yet to set targets due to not knowing how to. And I thought this was a really interesting quote from the interview to mention an accelerator stating that, you know, a lot of this work has been done on the off the side of their desk. So it hasn't been core to their operations, and it is challenging to find the ability to carve out space for this in some cases. Next, we see that 42% of organizations have signed on to at least one EDI-related pledge or challenge. However, there are reservations about signing on to a challenge without being accountable to quantitative targets. In terms of the pledges that we asked about, many of them were focused more on investment activities. We have the 50-30 challenge, all the way down to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment. And we can see here that not all organizations have signed on to every one. And the reason for this is that this was a trend that came up quite a few times in interviews, particularly across small impact investors, that they see pledges to be performative and superficial at times and very easy to sign on to without taking that next step in understanding what needs to be done from there. I'm just going to pause because I saw a hand raised. I'm just going to ask if we can save questions until the end. So we'll definitely jump back into this. Kathy, I see your hand. Our next insight is that 35% of organizations confirm having set aside a budget for EDI initiatives. We see here that the averages of the budget set are on the right side across the different types of organizations and different sizes. And interestingly, for organizations that have set aside this budget, it's allocated towards different buckets: consultant fees, audits, workshops, and curriculum development, postings on diversity-specific job boards. And for those who indicated that they don't know, it's mostly because they operate within a larger institution, like a university. So their EDI budget is operated by their parent organization, and they don't have insight into how that money is allocated. And for those who said no, it's because they are typically smaller and they either exist to advance EDI or expenditures are approved as needed, and there isn't a ceiling set on the budget that they allocate to this work. All right, shifting gears to look at EDI integrated into internal operations. So the way that this work is playing out and affecting staff across organizations. 69% of large organizations have an EDI committee in place compared to 33% of small organizations. And for every organization with a committee in place, particularly those of a large size, at least one representative from senior leadership is a member, and they try to have team members from different functions of the organization join this committee. And it made a lot of sense in the interviews why smaller organizations don't yet have an EDI committee or don't see the need to, because they mentioned that a lot of these conversations around EDI are brought up in regular team meetings where they have only 2 to 9 team members present anyway. Looking at the policies that organizations have in place, we see that the most common policies are related to gender equality, with 95% of organizations having at least one of these 3 gender equal workplace policies in place at their organization. We also see flex time and telecommuting to be a fairly commonly found policy in place. Anti-sexual harassment policy is more commonly found across large organizations. In equal opportunity policy, again, quite frequently found. And then we see that conversely, just 52% of organizations have a fair remuneration policy in place. And all of these policies are defined in the report. So if you have any questions about understanding what these mean and what they might mean for your organization, I encourage you to take a look there. And in the interview process, we saw that respondents mentioned that these policies oftentimes don't mean too much unless they're put into action. So one of my favorite parts of the report highlights the ways that organizations are putting these policies into practice. So as examples, for an equal opportunity policy, rather than stating that accommodations can be made, say, through an interview process, actively integrating these inclusive measures throughout. So captioning during info sessions, hosting office hours before applications are due to ensure that all applicants have access to the same information. When looking at flex time and telecommuting, we see increasingly more that organizations are allowing team members to select the days off that they want to recognize and honor. As an example, recognizing National Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Canada Day. And finally, for fair remuneration, having team members track activities to show the division of labor across the functions of their organization, so that we can understand how different team members are allocating their time. And finally, jumping into looking at how investors and accelerators are supporting their portfolio and program ventures, we see that more small impact investors self-assessed and indicated that they actively aim to invest using an equity lens than large impact investors. And we did keep the definition of actively aim, which is underlined there, broad, and the scale to which impact investors actually embed these efforts and track their progress is still unknown, and would like to dive into that further in the next iteration of this research. We see here that the percentages of small impact investors that actively aim to invest in ventures led by women, Black people, Indigenous peoples, and people of color or BIPOC, and BIPOC women, as well as people who identify as LGBTQIA2S+ and as persons with disabilities, is approximately double that of large impact investors who actively aim to invest with that same lens. And from the interview process, we also were able to glean some insights into how impact investors suggest, taking this step to try to invest in equity deserving founders. And some of those include helping ventures to become investment ready, so becoming involved in a capacity building or acceleration program that primes equity deserving founders to be successful when raising capital. The two examples mentioned were Enterprising Women and the Fireweed Fellowship. And second, tailoring the application and investment process, particularly for small impact investors who have this flexibility, allowing founders to not adhere to the same formula and being flexible in that due diligence and decision-making process. And this is a quote that came from one of the small impact investors that we spoke to, and I think it really speaks volumes to the importance of building that relationship first before going too deep into the process, and underscoring that need to move at the speed of trust. And the final insight that I'll share with you today, looking at the self-assessment of EDI efforts related to program ventures across social impact accelerators. And we saw that within the survey, more social impact accelerators indicated that they actively aim to recruit ventures led by women, BIPOC and BIPOC women, rather than recruiting ventures led by founders who identify as LGBTQIA2S+ or as persons with disabilities. And again, actively aim was left broad, and these are self-assessments. We see here that the percentages of accelerators, both across small and large sizes, are roughly double that when looking at a gender and ethnicity lens, rather than a diverse sexual orientation or disability lens. And finally, sharing a few insights from social impact accelerators when recruiting equity deserving founders within the marketing and communications of recruiting new founders, promoting and spotlighting entrepreneurs, and telling the success stories of diverse entrepreneurs in media, print, and online material. We also see the need to engage community partners in promotional activities, and accelerators really highlighted the need to work in partnership with organizations, particularly through the recruitment process, and turning to those who have engaged with these communities, trying to build that trust to share opportunities widely. And finally, just going to leave with a quote from one of the small impact accelerators that we spoke to, that shows the need to have representation and recognize ourselves in the people that we look up to. So making sure that we can highlight and showcase these stories of entrepreneurs who have done this work. And so on that note, I there's a lot more in the report on the insights, and really inviting you to dig into those. But I'm going to pass it over to Emily to share a little bit more about the so what behind what we found.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn. So yes, with all of the data that we had to do some analysis. And with these findings, what do we know about equity, diversity, and inclusion across Canadian impact investors and social impact accelerators? That's what we asked ourselves. And we came up with 4 main topics. So the first one of them, the first thing we really noticed digging through this data is that the main factor influencing the speed of implementing EDI is an organization's size. So small organizations will develop practices and policies as needs arise, in contrast to large organizations that formalize EDI practices. So next slide. Yes, thank you very much. So, so smaller organizations will not necessarily have committees. The teams are smaller. People speak with each other very much, and they consider that EDI is within their DNA. So they consider very often they don't necessarily need to do that, and they are agile. They see a lot of innovation going on and get inspired by a lot of good practices. But there is a danger. It's when the organization grows and people change within the teams. Will the values always remain the same? So organizations must remain cautious. And larger organizations will have more budget in place for initiatives. They will have more people involved. They will build committees. So there's a lot of institutionalization of processes. And the 23 fewer large organizations than small organizations actively aim to invest in or recruit ventures led by equity deserving founders. So we see here that larger organizations have the weight of their entire structure and institutionalization, pardon me for my pronunciation. So they are not as agile in their way to turn their tendencies in the programs and the people they include in their programs and the portfolio they have as smaller organizations are. The second thing we really noticed is that impact investors and social impact accelerators encounter practical and ethical challenges when collecting self-identified disaggregated data. So what it means is that in a practical way, organizations that participated did not consider that they did not view or prioritize the practice of tracking self-identified data in a uniform way. So they did not know what type of information to collect, and they did not necessarily use the same vocabulary. They did not necessarily ask people to assess the information themselves. So self-assessment, there's a lot of assumption going on. And when you say you have a portfolio based on gender or based on groups of equity deserving backgrounds of different groups, then you have to ask people who they are and who they perceive themselves to be as well, to have a fairer assessment of what your portfolio is, because otherwise you're going to think maybe that you're making improvements, but you will not have clear data. And also it is very important to go sometimes with disaggregated data, because if you say, let's say 70% of people of a certain, 70% of all of our portfolio are going through a certain situation, maybe you will have a beautiful image of what's happening. But if you look through a certain profile of people, you will notice that certain individuals encounter specific challenges. So this is why it's very important to go through that. However, like certain types of diversity are more visible, but some other types of diversity are less visible, which makes it so that this can bring ethical challenges, because sometimes you can couple informations together, and some people could potentially be open to be targeted or have their privacy be undermined. The third point that we really wanted to raise was that impact investors and social impact accelerators appear to lean on external sources when identifying EDI targets and benchmarks. What this means is, or where this comes from, is that a lot of people mentioned lack of resources, and they said they don't necessarily have a person internally with enough time on their hand or with the necessarily knowledge to develop the EDI strategy for the organization. So this is where consultants sometimes come in, and of course, larger organizations will usually have more money than smaller organizations to hire a consultant. So this is one way to make sure that you have more resources. Some people sign to pledges, but some organizations, as Sherilyn already mentioned, express that sometimes there are some doubts about the utility when it's not accompanied by tangible quantitative goals. A lot of organizations think they do not necessarily have the knowledge or skills needed to implement EDI practices. But as we will see later on, is that a lot of the best practices are not yet known, and we will dig into that later. And organizations mentioned a lack of practice, but organizations should also contextualize EDI goals within the geography, sector, and communities where they operate. So they can ask for external help, but they should know that they also have access to a lot of resources regarding what's already available out there, and build from the ground up with what's available and work on, who is the surrounding community and how can I fit in with my organizations. And sometimes another reason why people hire external help, and this comes from secondary research. So for some of the analysis part, we use secondary research as well. There's the mitigating reputational risks. So since a lot of people feel like they may be walking on eggshells in certain contexts, then some research suggests that hiring externally is a good way to say, look, we've tried at least, and if it doesn't work, it's not necessarily entirely our fault. So there needs to be more accountability. So this is also a point to mention. And the last point, impact investors and social impact accelerators identify a challenge in recruiting talent with sector-specific skills who are also representative of the communities where they operate. So the organizations want to improve, but more needs to be done. So 48% of participating organizations are prioritizing equitable recruitment practices, but organizations find it difficult to find and recruit candidates with technical skills needed, particularly from equity-deserving groups, reflecting a disconnect between candidates and employers. So sometimes there can be also discrimination when hiring. Like sometimes, it could be in certain cases difficult to find somebody, but sometimes the pipelines just do not align, and a lot of people will have a network in their own community and will not necessarily know where else to look, which will close the door to a lot of very qualified people. And sometimes, organizations use a lot of flexibility to hire, and they're like, oh, this could be good. We could have a person coming in. But when it comes to hiring someone from an equity deserving background, sometimes the same flexibility is not always applied. So it could be good to really focus on key qualities and use some flexibility to be able to train some people who have the will, who have the knowledge, who have the drive and the emotional intelligence, and who represent communities. So to really be able to make sure that the pipeline of equity deserving candidates in organizations is connected. And so altogether, impact investors and social impact accelerators are striving to do better. They feel like they are already doing something, but they need like they feel like they're doing something in terms of EDI, but we remain in the dark. So there are good intentions in this sector, but not yet a shared consensus on measurement, data, policies, and practices to back these intentions up and keep organizations accountable for their progress over time. Organizations also often lack resources to or may not prioritize working on EDI in their operations. And as there are diverse approaches to embed EDI, organizations may be prone or afraid to make mistakes. So therefore, we need to be resilient and committed as we embark on a path forward.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for that, and Sherilyn. So now what? So, across all sectors, leaders are grappling with their role and their responsibility to embrace equitable practices and build inclusive teams. And when we embarked on the In the Dark report, we took a very holistic approach to diversity, looking across gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, in an effort to outline an overview of effective practices and get a better understanding of what some of those gaps are among impact investors and social impact accelerators, and truly be that kind of a launching pad into more research, more work, greater investment, to have the values of social finance and social innovation map to our operations, how we flow capital, who we invest in, and who we trust. This is a quote we think very relevant in kind of pulling together some of the themes of the research, but systemic discrimination isn't intuitive until you experience it directly, and only becomes widely visible through data analysis. So data, information, measurement are all going to be critical elements of our path forward. So as we think about this path, Canadian social innovation and the social finance sector has a very unique opportunity to transform and more importantly, lead in how equity is centered in our work, and that we can move and shift out of this darkness. So what that means is that we need to amplify effective practices. We need to clarify and expose what is not effective. We need to build mechanisms for accountability within our sector. Peter, you had a comment about the grandizing of kind of what we're doing. And again, how do we know that what we're saying is actually translating into the work and the impact and the flows of capital? And this includes transparency in setting and monitoring and reporting on EDI goals. And finally, we need a long-term commitment of human and financial capital to execute on this work. We have mapped out now 5 more practical things that the sector can do right away in partnership with some of the players that you may know. So if we move to the next section, this space is an evolving space, one of a tremendous amount of opportunity, and in doing so, in locking that equity in the way we work, in the way we flow capital, there is an opportunity to unlock deeper social impact and build more greater and inclusive economic prosperity. And so we've mapped out a few ways in which you in the audience can start and partner on this work. So the first is a collection of disaggregated demographic data on leadership teams at impact investment funds, social impact accelerators, and social ventures in partnership with New Power Labs. So again, we know that there's some pain points in collecting disaggregated demographic data. We know it's very valuable. And if we're saying we have the intentionality to invest in diverse communities, unless we're mapping who we're investing in and how capital flows, we're not going to be able to understand progress toward that goal. So we welcome all folks who are interested in this work to partner with New Power Labs, who will be providing support on this. The second is create structured and standardized recruitment processes, starting with anti-bias interview tools offered by Social Innovation Academy. And what we know is that equitable hiring and recruitment processes are critical to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so not only can you find these resources and supports through the Social Innovation Academy, New Power Labs is going to continue to aggregate and synthesize existing and emerging research and share it through our platform as we evolve. The next is participate in an EDI policy benchmarking through a new initiative that we've launched at New Power Labs. So when we think about, we saw that chart of the various policies that exist across organizations. We've partnered with a tech firm, Claushound, and are going to work specifically with impact investors across the next few months to go deeper into their policies and understand opportunities and gaps that prevent equity, and work with these organizations to provide a disaggregated view of these policy gaps and a way to evolve their organizations. And the fourth is joining a community of peer organizations committed to sharing their EDI knowledge. There's a solidarity working group, and Victor, I'll invite you to come and share a few words on that. And there's New Power Labs, and New Power Labs is working with capital deployers, specifically looking at organizations who are eager to embark on that journey of embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion within their work. And you can reach out to us on our website. And Victor, if you want to jump on, the Solidarity Working Group is another channel for you to join in on this journey.
Yeah, thank you, Narinder. So systemic racism, microaggressions, micro invalidations, micro assaults, these things happen on a day-to-day basis in the impact investing space and social finance ecosystem. Boards, investment committees, the flow of capital shows a censoring of whiteness as a standard. And to be honest with you, at SETSI, we were just tired of trying to bring our own seat to a table or begging to be at a table, so we built our own. We co-founded it with many remarkable partners and allies to show what inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, and subsequently belonging really looks like. So if you would like to get in contact with the folks at Solidarity Working Group, one of my colleagues will put our systems collaborators' email address, Jaleesa Brown, in the chat. And we look forward to contributing in any way we can to this important work.
Great, thank you, Victor. And lastly, embrace the journey. Driving meaningful change in equity, diversity, and inclusion requires a sustained commitment and an adoption of both small-scale changes and transformative actions. It's going to require us valuing and advancing EDI as essential work that is core to what we're doing, to both not only improving the operations of our organizations, but acknowledging that this is a journey we're going to go on as a collective and as a group. You know, when we think back to what is the aim of social finance and social innovation, and it's to make progress towards reducing inequality, addressing the climate crisis, among other things. And we have this really unique opportunity today, and I believe the conditions to embark on this journey and embed and change the way we flow capital, change the way we do things, to ultimately hit that impact objectives we all share. So on that note, we hope that this report will raise further interest and a commitment to actions to realize these changes in a meaningful way. We've heard a lot of insights on what the sector looks like, a lot of opportunities on where we can go deeper, and we want to now open it up to Q&A to explore questions from the audience. Okay, Sherilyn, I know there's a few coming out. Not sure if Sherilyn is going to come back. There we go. Okay.
All right, just trying to organize some of the questions that have come up in the chat. So the first, I'm going to read them out loud for the sake of the recording, from Anna. Did you learn anything in the interview process about how investors are defining their notion of social impact in relation to business models, and who gets to evaluate this impact? Is it the investors or the communities served? So I'm going to turn it over maybe to Narinder to speak to this first.
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. And in many ways, the way we evaluate social impact is still early in our journey. I have a small impact investment fund, which is a gender lens and social impact equity lens fund. And, you know, you take an example like gender lens investing. when folks think about gender lens investing, they often think at a very superficial level of, okay, I'm going to invest in women, which is one component of it. And they fail to recognize a holistic approach to embedding gender lens and deeper social impact into their evaluation of various companies. And so that's a fairly common approach within the sector. So as we get more transparency on what impact is, we'll see, I think, a shift within that. That specific question was out of scope on this research. We did not dive into it, but it is an area that we're eager to dig deeper into in future research.
Victor or Emily, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
No, Narinder hit the nail on the head.
Great. So our next question, I'm just looking at the Q&A first, and then I'll jump into the chat. So did you start with an idea of gold standards in terms of what should be in place in an organization for EDI? And I can take this one first. We actually didn't. We wanted to understand what organizations are doing on the ground before we put into an idea what we should be working towards. And there were several reasons for that. One is that, this journey doesn't end anywhere. It needs to continuously we need to be continuously learning and moving towards new goals and targets as we improve over time, but there's no end goal in sight. And we wanted to create this baseline standard based on what is happening right now and not where we want to be in the future. So that's the approach that we took with this research.
And this does link into future work on what is that benchmark. And so we hope that collectively we'll come together with many of you in the room to co-create that as we move forward.
All right. And then, Emily.
If I may do a little pitch in favor of action research, defining standards is not something easy. When we've been talking about being in the dark, it means that there's a lot of unknown, a lot of unknown territory. So action research is the type of research that enable participating organizations to interact with researchers to see, okay, what is it that we could do? What is our first hypothesis? How could we try it, validate it, see whether it works or not? We analyze how it went, and then we try a second version. So this way, it's a way to be resilient in always attempting to improve practices. So this is how better standards, this is at least one of the ways that better standards can be established, and in a very empowering way for the organizations and in co-construction with everyone involved.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. And quickly, did we speak to people at all levels of these organizations or only senior leaders? So we reached out and had either between 1 to 3 representatives from each organization. And actually in the report, we mentioned that over 50% of the individuals that represented their organizations came from respective leadership teams, which was defined at being at the director level or higher. But we weren't able to assess across, various levels of an organization. We just had one point person. And did you ask any open questions about what inequalities are plaguing these organizations in this industry? That's a really good question. I'll speak first to what was asked at the very beginning of the interview, and that was, what has really prompted this work? And I can't remember the wording exactly, but the responses really was wide-ranging. Either organizations have been committed to this work for a few years now, but many organizations did mention the COVID-19 crisis and how that really exacerbated and showcased the inequities across race and gender. There were several key events that happened in 2020 and 2021 that were mentioned. Just the death of George Floyd was mentioned by quite a few organizations as that catalyst in the summer of 2020. And last year as well, the discovery of graves across Canada, a residential school site. So there were, these questions asked, and that's how organizations kind of shared what their catalysts were. I don't know if that really answers the question exactly, but Narinder or anyone want to jump in?
I'll just add, this is, again, want you to understand this is one part of a longer series of research that is needed to unpack and better understand not only our current state, but how we move forward.
Yeah, I think that the racial reckoning that's been happening across Turtle Island or across North America is important because it's leading CEOs and organizations and leaders to really rethink their DEI or IDEA policies, procedures, and the way they approach their work. But I believe that we can't have a reactionary stance, and we have to make sure that we transition those moments to movements. Yes, systemic transformation is incremental, system change is long, but once again, this research is one step in the right direction.
And final question from Anna. Did you evaluate what percentage of an organization's budget is typically being spent on EDI? We did not capture that data. We just have the number that they have allocated towards this work. And just, I know we're over time, but I am just going to jump into the chat to see if there are any remaining questions that we'd like to answer. Sorry, give me 1 second.
And as you're doing that, I'll just recap a few of the next steps. So the report, both in English and French, will be sent to everyone on this call and will be made available publicly in the next few days. So stay tuned to that. There's a series of actionable next steps for everyone in this room, and we hope you can join us on this journey together. And we will be giving you conduits either through the SIA, SETSI, New Power Labs, to start or continue your journey on equity. And the third is all of us are committed to advancing equity within the sector and in the space. And so as in all the forms of partnership, we are all eager to hear from you, to learn from you, to work with you on this kind of collective journey for doing better.
Great, thank you, Narinder. And the final question that I'm seeing here is asking about the interview tools and anti-bias resources offered by SIA and if they're available to the public. So please reach out to us at hello@socialinnovationacademy.ca. I can drop that into the chat, and we'll be happy to share our resources with you.
Great, awesome. Well, on behalf of SETSI, SIA, New Power Labs, our awesome ASL interpreters, we want to thank you for joining us today. For all the participants who are part of the research, thank you. For the broader sector, this is the right moment to drive change, and we're excited to be working in partnership with all of you.